We told you on the show a few weeks ago how just 3 Americans, Bill Gates, Warren Buffett, and Jeff Bezos, have more wealth than the entire bottom half of the United States population. By some calculations, the U.S. has the highest level of economic inequality in the entire developed world. And the tax bill that is working its way through Congress is probably only going to make things worse. It will further enrich families like, well, Donald Trump's. Now, a new study published in the journal Nature gives us some big historical perspective going way back. A team of researchers led by the archaeologist Timothy Kohler at Washington State University examined ancient or prehistoric societies using a very modern tool. It's a scale you might have heard of called the Gini coefficient. Developed by an Italian statistician in the early 1900s, the Gini measures inequality on a scale of 0 to 1. In a group of people who all have the same amount of wealth, you would have a Gini score of 0. In a group in which one individual has all the wealth and all the others have nothing, you would have a Gini score of 1, so 0 to 1. The German bank Allianz has one of the most quoted Gini scales out there. It ranks the United States as the most unequal nation with a score of 0.81. Germany is lower with 0.73. Russia is at 0.69. The most equal countries on the scale are South Korea with a 0.54, China with a 0.53, and Slovakia with a 0.48. All of them, of course, far from totally equal, which would be 0. So Kohler and his team took the Gini coefficient and applied it to archaeological data from 63 societies, some dating back 11,000 years to the beginning of the New Stone Age, when societies started to settle down, build permanent structures, and plant crops. Kohler had few records to draw on from this period, and some of the archaeological sites were better preserved than others, but what they did all have, and what Kohler's team decided to physically measure, were the remains of houses. Big ones for richer people, smaller ones for their poorer neighbors. And what their research suggests is fascinating. Before the advent of agriculture, which is relatively recent in the long perspective of human history, it began around 9000 BC, there was very little inequality. Hunter-gatherer societies had low median Gini scores, 0.17. Then came the domestication of animals, especially the large ones native to Europe and Asia. That did all the heavy farming work. So if you had oxen or horses to help you till your fields, you were a much more efficient farmer. Thus, you could sell more crops at the market and get richer. With that extra wealth, you would buy more horses or oxen and plow more fields and get even richer. And then you could leave it all to your children. Meanwhile, the farmers who could not afford animals were just left behind. Thus began human inequality, and it often perpetuated itself. Now, modern societies found ways to break the cycle through capitalism and meritocracy, which allow bright and successful people of no means to rise up. But this new elite has, in many countries, found ways of perpetuating itself by stacking the deck in its favor, as the tax bill does. The greatest inequality the team found was a 0.68 in Kahun, an ancient Egyptian settlement. It's bad, of course, but not as bad as the Gini score of the current-day United States. Kohler, who studied the rise and fall of societies across millennia, has some words of warning for us. If we become too unequal, violence and state collapse could follow. Next on GPS, my exclusive interview with the Secretary General of the United Nations on Jerusalem, North Korea, and his relations with President Trump. Don't forget, if you miss a show, go to cnn.com/Fareed for a link to my iTunes podcast. 81, that calls for the city of Jerusalem to be a corpus separatum, a separate entity under international control. After fighting the following year, 1948, Jordan took control of the city's east, while Israel got the western part. In 1967, Israel wrested control of the entire city. 2 years following that original 1947 resolution, Antonio Manuel de Oliveira Guterres was born in Lisbon, Portugal. A lifelong activist, politician, and diplomat, Guterres now serves as the Secretary General of the United Nations. On Wednesday, after the president's announcement, Guterres said, "We were in a moment of great anxiety. I sat down with him later in the week in the chambers of the UN Security Council." Mr. Secretary General, pleasure to have you on.
It's an honor, pleasure to be here with you.
What do you think is the danger of President Trump's recognition of Jerusalem? You spoke out with some concern about it.
Well, I was quite hopeful in relation to the efforts that President Trump was making with his team to try to bring Israelis and Palestinians to accept a solution. I mean, until now, in the past, we had several times a peace process. But the fact is that peace processes went on and on and on, and at a certain moment they would break, and then things would get worse than what they were. And I think President Trump had the intuition that probably the best would be to try to negotiate a full package. And I know that Kushner and others were very strongly involved in dialogue with the Palestinians and Israelis, and there was some hope that it would be possible. I'm not saying it will happen, but there was a hope that it would be possible to finally bring this horrible conflict between Israelis and Palestinians to an end. I think that the decision that was taken Wednesday risks to compromise this effort, and if that is the case, it would be a pity, because it would be so important to find a solution to this crisis. In my opinion, it must be a two-state solution, but it is so important to find a solution for this crisis.
You said that you were hopeful and even impressed by some of the things President Trump was saying to you, I imagine, on the Israeli-Palestinian side. On many other issues, he has seemed to take a very negative view of international institutions, multilateralism, global agreements. He's pulled out of the Paris Accords. He's defunding or pulling out of U.S. funding of UNESCO. Do you think this is the United States turning its back on institutions like the UN that it created after World War II?
Well, I think that there is a vision that is expressed in the sentence America First. The vision that the interests of the American people are best protected by the U.S. in itself, and that international organizations do not contribute much to it, and that the engagement of the United States in many of the global issues of today are less relevant for the interests of the American people. I believe it's not true. The U.S. is too big and too relevant to be able to think it alone. The way things happen in the world has a very important impact in the way things happen in the United States. And so, in my belief, it is very important for the world, and it's very important for the United States, that the U.S. engages in climate action, engages in migration, but also engages in addressing crises like the crisis in Syria or Iraq or Afghanistan or South Sudan or the DRC, where the role of the U.S. can be extremely important to allow for solutions to be found, to have leverage, to have pressure on the actors to these conflicts in order to be able to make them understand that it's necessary to stop those conflicts. And in the end, what is clear is that wherever the US doesn't occupy the space, someone else will do. And this, in the end, will be, in my opinion, detrimental to American interests, and also the lack of capacity to have a stabilizing influence in the world, in the multiplicity of crises we have, where conflicts are so much interlinked and linked to problems of global terrorism. I think that to disengage in world affairs also impacts negatively on the security of any people, including the American people.
As you say, when the United States steps back, others step forward, and naturally their interests and values might be different. I feel as though you're already seeing this with the rise of China, with China saying that it's more than happy to play a larger role. Of course, you have a certain amount of it happening with Russia. Is that dynamic already accelerating?
I think that dynamic is evident. First, we are no longer in a unipolar world or a bipolar world of the Cold War. But we are not yet in a multipolar world. We are in a kind of a chaotic world where different countries are trying to assert themselves in different ways, and not only the big powers like China or Russia. You see the influence of countries like Iran or Saudi Arabia or Turkey. So this is a world that became difficult to predict, where unpredictability and impunity are the new rules of the game. And that is why American influence is so important, as a stabilizing factor. Now, the truth is that for a country like China that has a very clear long-term strategy, I believe China considers that they have chances to become the largest economic power in the world in the near future. It is clear that wherever the United States leaves some space, China will occupy it from the development point of view. If one looks at geostrategic considerations in the Middle East, for instance, it's clear wherever the US withdraws, Russia or Iran or Saudi Arabia will consider there is an opportunity for them. So it is obvious for me that from the point of view of the international community as a whole, the fact that the United States does not engage in a situation is not positive, makes things less predictable, and from the point of view of the United States, I think it also represents a threat in the long term. Because we live in a world where the dangers are real for all of us. I mean, for decades we had no concerns with the nuclear danger. With the North Korea crisis, and now with the questions about the future of the relationship between the US and Iran in relation to the nuclear question, I think that there is a risk that non-proliferation enters in a difficult moment in the near future. So there is, again, and we forgot about it since the Cold War, a nuclear threat. If you look at the global Middle East, now it's not only the Syria crisis or the Iraq crisis, everything is now interlinked. You have the memory of the Cold War still, the US-Russia relationship, but you have the Israeli-Palestinian question, but you have the Shia-Sunni, and all these contradictions are now piling up, interacting with each other, and making the whole Middle East becoming a very dangerous area for the world, in my opinion, because also linked to problems of global terrorism. And then we have climate change, which is probably the defining threat of our times. And I believe that when the world is facing these kind of threats, it's very important to come together. It's very important the role of multilateral organizations, and it's very important that a country like the United States plays a constructive and engaged role.
Next on GPS, I'll be back with much more of my interview with Secretary General Guterres. We'll talk about what to do about the world's thorniest problem, North Korea. A fitting place perhaps to talk about the drums of war that are starting to sound between North Korea and the United States. The general feeling is that North Korea the situation is at an impasse. There is no good military option. The North Koreans seem determined to acquire a large and robust nuclear capacity. They already have it in many senses. And the only country that could do something about it is China, which will not cut off the fuel supplies because they worry about a collapse. If that's the reality, is there a solution, or is the world going to have to live with a nuclear North Korea that might have an arsenal in a few years larger than that of Great Britain?
Well, I have my political director in Pyongyang at the present moment, so I think hope is the last thing we can afford to lose. There is a very important factor here, the unity of the Security Council. Of course, that has not yet solved the problem, but it is clear that there is now a very large pressure over North Korea. And I think the North Koreans are feeling it. If that unity is maintained, and I strongly hope that it is maintained, I think it also paves the way for a diplomatic initiative to be possible. I don't think China controls North Korea. I think North Korea became an entity in itself. But I think that for the North Koreans, there is also a question of survival that is very important. And my belief is that if the unity of the Security Council is maintained, I think North Korea can be forced to come to a meaningful dialogue, namely with the United States. That is probably the only power they fear. And paved the way for the effective denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. And I think we should do everything we can to reach that objective. And I believe that a diplomatic solution is the way to achieve it without a level of danger that, again, would be unpredictable in its consequences if a military option would be taken.
You were the High Commissioner for Refugees, and we look at the situation for refugees around the world, which is really the worst it's ever been since World War II. The Trump administration's new travel ban has just been okayed by the Supreme Court. What do you say to the American administration, which appears the United States already takes very few refugees and appears now to be closing its doors even to that small number?
What I say to the American administration, or to Europe, or to countries in the North in general, is that it is essential to reestablish the integrity of the refugee protection regime. That is based in international law. And it's essential to understand that refugees are not terrorists. They are the first victims of terror. They are those that flee because of the action of terrorists. And that when one looks at countries like Jordan or Lebanon that have received millions of refugees with enormous generosity, or Kenya and Uganda, I think it's very important that the developed world shows that we are ready in the developed world to have our share, to receive also a meaningful number of refugees. Of course, there are security concerns. And there are ways, fortunately, in relation to registration, to screening, today to be able to detect those situations in which there could be a security risk. And I have to say that my experience is that those that really have terrorist intents, they look for other ways to move, because the refugee movement is so scrutinized that it really is not the best opportunity from that point of view. But there are ways to do effective screening and to guarantee the security, namely of resettlement programs. So my appeal to the global north, to the developed world, is be more generous to refugees, be more able to share the huge contribution that countries in the south, like the ones I mentioned, are giving, and that will be, in my opinion, a very important factor to increase peace and stability in the world.
You mentioned that you felt the world was getting more chaotic, not so much multipolar. Do you worry that this chaos is getting to the point where it's turning into anarchy?
Let's hope not. I think the role of the United Nations is exactly to avoid it. The Security Council, we are sitting in the room of the Security Council, as its mission, its primary mission, to preserve peace and security in the world. We have seen that the divisions in the Security Council have made it difficult. It's our role to do everything possible to avoid this rather unstructured situation of global power, not to lead to the kind of chaos that would make the terrible dangers we are already facing to become much worse. I think it's time for people to understand that what divides the countries around this table is much less than the vital interest to preserve global security and the vital interest to address challenges like climate change.
Mr. Secretary General. To all of you in the United States and around the world, I'm Fareed Zakaria. Today on the show, President Trump breaks decades of tradition on Jerusalem.
It is time to officially recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel.
Those words upset America's allies and enemies alike. One ally was, of course, pleased.
President Trump, thank you for today's historic decision.
But will it put peace even further out of reach? I have a great panel to debate. Also, it was the United Nations that laid out the plan for Jerusalem in 1947. I have an exclusive interview with the Secretary General to get his reaction and to talk about his broader relations with President Trump, and also what can possibly be done about North Korea.
Hope is the last thing we can afford to lose.
But first, here's my take. With his decision to move the American embassy to Jerusalem, President Trump did something puzzling for a person who claims to be a great deal maker. He made a massive, preemptive concession to one side in a complicated negotiation without getting anything for it in return. If that's how he operates, it's no wonder so many of his former colleagues think he isn't actually a very successful businessman after all. Jerusalem is Israel's capital and will remain so. I don't dispute the fact or its merits. But the reason that all 86 countries that have embassies in Israel have so far located them in Tel Aviv is that Jerusalem is an integral part of the final settlement between Israelis and Palestinians. The Palestinians claim the city as their capital as well. It contains sites sacred to all three of the world's Abrahamic faiths. It has within it a large Arab population that even after decades of new Israeli settlements, comprises more than a third of the city's total. So the formal status of Jerusalem has always been seen by Republicans and Democrats, Europeans and Asians, as a matter to be codified in the context of peace between Israel and the Palestinians. Far from being part of a larger strategic plan, Trump's announcement appears to be a one-off decision designed largely to delight core elements of Trump's base at home, evangelical Christians and pro-Israeli donors. The only strategic aspect appears to be that it will help shore up the GOP base on the eve of Roy Moore's senatorial contest in Alabama. That is not diplomacy, that's pandering. There are ways to solve the Jerusalem problem, such as by carving out some neighborhoods in the eastern part of the city and allowing the Palestinians to claim those as their capital. Trump's announcement actually did not specifically foreclose this possibility, which makes the move even more puzzling. It actually achieves little on the ground, all the while offending millions of Palestinians, hundreds of millions of Arabs, and public opinion almost everywhere. When China, your European allies, the Pope, the kings of Saudi Arabia and Jordan all voice strong opposition, it is surely worth questioning the wisdom of the policy. While many people have predicted violence in the Middle East, it's likely that this will be contained. Israel is now the regional superpower, and its neighbors know it. It also has tight control over the Palestinian territories with a network of barriers, checkpoints, and intelligence operations. Terrorism for most Israelis is a problem that has simply gone away. The real danger is that this decision only adds to the mounting despair of Palestinians, who are already weak, divided, and dysfunctional. They've never had good leadership. They barely have any leadership now. They live in an unusual, almost unique condition in the modern world, citizens of no state, without a country of their own. Meanwhile, Israel will continue to prosper economically and maintain its genuinely democratic character, but with this one large caveat: it will rule over lands with millions of people who lack full political rights. That cancer at the heart of Israel's democratic system and culture will remain and might intensify as Israeli Arabs grow in number. There will be an Israel that looks like Switzerland, surrounded by a Palestine that looks like Bangladesh. It's possible that at some point this inequality of income, status, and political rights will lead to some kind of explosion. It will certainly lead to greater polarization and discord. And America's action this week will have deepened these fissures and exacerbated those tensions. For more, go to cnn.com/Fareed and read my Washington Post column this week. And let's get started. Let me bring on others to continue this conversation on the President's controversial moves on Jerusalem. Richard Haass is the President of the Council on Foreign Relations and the author of A World in Disarray. Hanan Ashrawi is a Palestinian lawmaker, a member of the Executive Committee of the PLO, and a former negotiator and spokesperson for the Palestinians. She joins us from Ramallah. And Dori Gold was Israel's ambassador to the UN, amongst many other diplomatic posts. He is president of the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs and joins us from Los Angeles. Hanan Ashrawi, let me start with you. What do you think the effect of this decision will be? Does it not simply ratify reality?
Not at all. On the contrary, it undermines the chances of peace. It totally destroys American credibility, standing, influence, and of course it disqualifies it from taking any role in peacemaking in the future. It also sends a message to the whole world that you can impose facts unilaterally outside the law and you will get away with it. But if you commit to a negotiated settlement based on legality and justice and international law, then you get no cooperation. This has moved the U.S. from being a so-called peace broker, and we knew from the beginning it was never even-handed, to becoming complicit with Israel in its crime. Israel has annexed East Jerusalem illegally in 1967, and of course it has placed West Jerusalem under its sovereignty in 1948, even though its legal status remains as a corpus separatum. So now we have a so-called peace broker that has taken sides blatantly and that has in many ways rewarded impunity and has sold out the Palestinian people as well as the chances of peace, and has succeeded in one fell swoop to undermine the security and stability of the whole region.
Dory Gold, isn't it fair to say that while this might provide some emotional satisfaction for Israelis, that it ratifies this sense of Jerusalem as their capital, which it is de facto, it does complicate, at the very least, perhaps threaten the peace process, any ultimate deal with the Palestinians, and it feels like, in return for that little emotional frisson, you're giving up a lot.
Well, I view it quite the opposite. I think in order for negotiations to succeed, and I've been involved in a series of negotiations from the days of the Hebron Accord to the Y Agreement and onward, you have to get the parties into what I call the box of realism. And unfortunately, those who've been engaged in peace negotiations on the Palestinian side haven't been there. Partly it's not their fault. Partly it's the fault of the international community, which has organizations like UNESCO, which in May 2017 adopted yet another resolution which disqualified Israel, cut off the historical and legal ties of Israel to Jerusalem. And in a certain sense, what President Trump has done, he's introduced an important correction. I may say a brave correction in that whole history of UNESCO resolutions that aren't based on international law. They're not based on truth. They're based on political power being exercised against the state of Israel.
Richard Haas, can you split the difference on this? Can you be Solomon?
No, in some ways this conversation raises the issue of why would you want to put Jerusalem out there naked, alone at the beginning, as the engine, if you will, rather than the caboose. The sense was it was always going to be the most difficult issue to contend with as part of a final status. Yes, it does recognize one side of reality or reality. On the other hand, why would you do it so in an isolated way? If you are going to introduce Jerusalem, give something to the Israelis, why not ask something from the Israelis on settlements or something else? Why not give something or ask something both from the Palestinians? So my problem with this is just to trot out one thing now, the most combustible, volatile, emotional of issues, in isolation from the rest of diplomacy. I just don't understand what's the potential upside, but I do see for it an awful lot of potential downside.
All right, hold that thought. We're going to come back to talk with the Hanan Ashrawi. Is it fair to say that the Palestinian cause has never been particularly strongly championed by the Arabs other than as a rhetorical matter, and now is even less central to the views of Arabs? If you look at Saudi Arabia today, it seems to be in a tacit alliance with Israel because it is obsessed with Iran. The Palestinian issue has been thrown to the wayside completely. So are you now really on the losing side of this next great power game in the Middle East?
Certainly, the Palestinian question now is in an extremely difficult position, given the realities of the region, given the bloody transition we are undergoing throughout the Arab world, given the fact that we have proxy wars in countries like Syria and Libya, and even since the war on Iraq and now the war on Yemen and so on. And since there is a new polarization attempting to create a sort of Sunni-Shiite divide at the expense of the stability and unity of the whole region. Of course, all these have sidelined the Palestinian question and deprived us of much support that we really need. So I think that given also the fact that Israel's impunity has continued without any intervention, without any question, without any accountability, and destroying the two-state solution, by the way, and given the fact that U.S. cover for Israel has come out into outright collusion and has destroyed the charade of a peace process. So now we find that the Palestinians have to sort of turn inwards and look towards themselves on the one hand to strengthen their ability to remain on the land and to withstand all these pressures and changes, and on the other hand to reach out to the international community for sources of protection and accountability for Israel. So I would say yes, these changes are extremely drastic, and I think the whole region is on the verge of serious transformations that are not necessarily positive.
Dory Gold, one of the points that Hanan Ashrawi made in a New York Times op-ed, and that Saeb Erekat, the chief Palestinian negotiator for many years, also made, is that perhaps the Palestinians will now move away from a two-state solution to a one-state solution, to say, all right, if there are these millions of Palestinians who are being denied full political rights, the right to have their own country, perhaps what we need then, the Palestinians would say, is simply voting rights within Israel. We have to be citizens of some country, and we ask then that we begin citizenship in Israel. Isn't that a real danger here? If the two-state solution evaporates, that you will end up with a one-state solution with a majority Palestinian or Arab population?
Well, let me address what the real danger is in the Middle East. You hinted at it before, but just to answer your specific question, I was the Director General of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Israel, and we had a very clear diplomatic doctrine. Our doctrine was, first, we seek to negotiate with our Palestinian neighbors. Second of all, we're prepared to reach a generous compromise with our Palestinian neighbors. And third, we seek that any structure of a solution be based on cooperation between our two societies, between our two political entities. And that's what we've been pushing. And unfortunately, we've gotten a flat no on all three of these fundamentals of our diplomatic doctrine. Now, making it all the more complex is something you alluded to. The main diplomatic actor affecting the future of the Middle East is a man by the name of General Qasem Soleimani, who is the commander of the Quds forces of the Revolutionary Guards. And today, Iranian forces have boots on the ground in Lebanon, in Syria, in Yemen, and of course in Iraq. And that is really what's changed the nature of the Middle East. And if there is a consensus among all of us who support stability and support progress, it is that this Iranian role must be discontinued. And we hope that in our diplomacy and in our connections, whether above the table or below the table, we can put the Middle East on a better footing to oppose Iranian expansionism, which is now seeking to build a land bridge from Iraq all the way to the Mediterranean and a military presence in the areas in between.
Richard, could you imagine a one-state solution with Palestinians demanding, almost in a kind of Gandhi-esque, Martin Luther King way, kind of civil disobedience that just says, look, you have to give us some kind of rights. We live on this land, you control it. We can't be forever stateless.
I can imagine people pushing for it, but I don't think it can be a solution. Israel can't be a secure, prosperous, Jewish, democratic state, and to have things move in that direction, something's got to give. But there's an irony to this whole conversation. People like me have sat on your show, Fried, and criticized this administration for a lack of diplomacy towards North Korea or what they're doing to the State Department. So here you finally have a diplomatic initiative, but it's the wrong one. And it's actually, among other things, going to make it much more difficult for the United States to work with the Saudis and others against the Iranian imperial push. So we finally get some diplomacy. That's the good news. The bad news is it's a counterproductive example of it.
Because the Saudis, the Jordanians all say, look, to the Trump administration, they're saying this publicly, you've just complicated our lives because it's hard for us to ally with you while you're being so, seemingly one-sided on this.
All these regimes sit uneasily on top of their populations. This is an issue that has potentially real popular interest and emotion. And the Saudis in particular, who are so interested in consolidating power, this is just the sort of thing that might make it more difficult for them to be seen by their own people to be cozying up to the United States.
This and spending $500 million on a painting and $500 million on a yacht all in a few months.
All in the name of an anti-corruption campaign. Yes, it's hard to square that circle.
Hanan Ashrawi,